A First World War night landing ground was established at Kelstern on the Lincolnshire Wolds near Mill Farm in 1917. This landing ground was intended for No. 33 Squadron aircraft running low on fuel. It was little used, and the RAF had departed from it in March 1919. In July 1942, 400 acres of farmland, half a mile northeast of the First World War landing ground, were purchased by the Air Ministry to build an airfield to Class A standard. It was located only 4 miles from both Binbrook and Ludford Manor airfields. The minor road from Binbrook to South Ellington running across the centre of the site was closed, and construction work started during the winter. On the 18th of August 1943, RAF Kelstern opened as a No. 12 base substation under the parentage of RAF Binbrook in No. 1 Group Bomber Command. It was provided with 3 concrete runways, with the main at 2,000 yards and 2 subsidiaries at 1,400 yards. 36 loop-type half standings were provided off the encircling perimeter track. For the hangars, one T2 hangar was placed on the technical site on the northwest side of the airfield. A second T2 was placed near runway head 310, and a third on the north side of the airfield. The watch office was of the for all commands type. The technical site was of temporary buildings constructed to the northwest of the airfield, and the accommodation was dispersed in fields around it. On the 1st of October, No. 625 Squadron formed from sea flight of No. 100 Squadron, which had arrived from RAF Grimsby with Lancaster 1s and 3s, and on the 13th of the month it began operations by flying bullseye sorties. On the 18th to 19th of October, No. 625 Squadron flew its first operational sortie on a raid against Hanover. This raid was followed by a constant involvement in main force attacks, all except 5 of which were flown from Kelstern. On the 15th of October 1944, No. 170 Squadron was reformed at Kelstern from sea flight of No. 625 Squadron. It flew its first raid 4 nights later, when its Lancasters were sent to bomb Stuttgart. However, No. 170 Squadron was moved to Dunholm Lodge on the 22nd of October. On the 5th of April 1945, No. 625 Squadron moved to Scampton, probably due to the high number of airfields in the area and the risks of collisions through their overlapping flight paths. 7 days later, No. 12 base was disbanded and no other flying units were based at Kelstern. A total of 70 Lancasters and crews failed to return or were lost in crashes during operations from Kelstern. During 1965 to 66, the land was returned to the landowners for agriculture or was sold. The country roads across the airfield were reopened, and eventually much of the concrete was broken up and removed, and the hangars sold or dismantled. I first visited this airfield in the autumn of 2012 and was struck by how remote and how completely exposed to the elements it was. The memorial was found easily by the side of the road that passes through the former airfield. It was the loneliness that struck me most about the place, an intense loneliness and a silence. There are a number of accounts of paranormal phenomena and apparitions at this old airfield. Many have witnessed the noise of invisible Lancasters taking off and passing low overhead, or the sound of engines running as they pass the remains of this lonely airfield. Bruce Barrymore Halpenny asserts that many people, while they were standing on the old runway and when there was a mist, have reported hearing the sound of Merlin engines of an aircraft allegedly trying to land. In his Ghost Stations Volume 1, he himself had such an experience on a cold November morning. He was standing on part of the runway when he suddenly heard the drone of Merlin engines approaching. Being a former provost in the RAF, he was familiar with the drone of aircraft engines and identified it immediately as the sound of a Lancaster. But on looking for the aircraft, there was nothing there. The Battle of Britain-Lancaster was at the time down in Abingdon being repaired. There have been numerous reports of passing motorists who have given a lift to an airman wanting to go to RAF Kelstern. Bruce Barrymore Halpenny recounts of an airman carrying a kit bag being given such a lift, but when he got out of the car at the site of the former airfield, he disappeared. Of the most startling accounts is to be found in Ghost Stations Volume 7, where it is recorded that a couple in June 1995, having stopped their car at the airfield memorial, saw a young man in RAF uniform standing a few feet away from him. When they asked him if he was stationed in the area, he answered that he was stationed at Ludford Magna. The couple then turned around for a few minutes to look at the monument, and then, as they prepared to leave, they saw that the airman had vanished. RAF Ludford Magna had closed after the Cold War in 1964. Myself and Mark Newman arrived at RAF Kelstern, having already visited RAF Sandtoft, RAF Hemswell and RAF Dumholme Lodge, and so were more tired than we should be before conducting a session. Nonetheless, making the most of the opportunity, we did so, although for much of the time we sat in silence listening to the Spiritbox. Mark had the impression of a twin-engined aircraft, which he both saw and heard. The tail was rounded, being more pointed at the top, silver in colour with a round nose, and it seemed to be the description of the Mosquito. Mark then made contact with a man who he thought was ground crew, carrying a spanner in his hand and wearing dark blue overalls. As the session progressed, both Mark and I had the feeling that there were lots of spirits roaming the airfield as though lost. After a break, we tried to make contact again with the spirits. Mark described a man with sharp features of about 5'5" to 5'6", in an RAF uniform, with a white belt and white gloves. The hat had a peak and an RAF badge. As Mark described him to me, the man saluted and intimated there was something important about the white gloves, which Mark was constantly being shown, as was the act of polishing something that may have been a mace. Mark had the impression of a parade or a passing out with the band playing. He also received the name Bruce, and later the word Green, but whether these were to be joined, we cannot say. I picked up that the whole of Kelstern was full of spirits that seemed to be walking around on the runway, in and out of a fog. They were completely lost. I found the experience quite distressing, and I kept hearing the question again and again, why are we here? Then I picked up on someone in full bomber leathers who walked out of the fog with the World War II leather helmet on. He looked at me for a minute and then simply faded back into the fog again. He was followed by a woman wearing bright red lipstick with a green chiffon scarf and a black and white check wool skirt, but she too simply faded back into the fog. At that point we had stopped through exhaustion and called an end to the day's session. Spiritbox was laying on the ground between us as we had some coffee and some food, with the recorder by its side, and for a while we let it run to see if there was much radio interference. There was none. All we were receiving was the whoosh 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 of the scan. The settings were what I was customarily using at the time, on FM set at 200 millisecond sweep rate and sweeping in reverse. When we started asking questions, we started getting voices from the box. Can you say if you're ground crew? Can you tell me the name of the pub that you used to drink at? Are you male? It's an interesting place, isn't it? But it's in the middle of nowhere. Can you tell me what music you liked? Can you name any of the other aircraft? Frank, you are. You get lots of people come here. And that was the end of the responses from RAF Kelstern. It had been a long day and involved investigations at 4 airfields. it was time for a last cup of coffee and then to pack everything away and start the 140-mile journey home. This day, although highly enjoyable, taught me that only a certain amount of spirit contact can be done at any one time. What we had done during the day was far too much. Indeed, for the next week it felt as though I had a dose of flu. It is only now that I feel up to the task of fully processing the received responses. However, what we achieved from this and the other airfields was a good selection of responses, with one or two choice words which would never be broadcast over a radio. It is clear that my work investigating Second World War airfields is far from over, and many more need to be visited and recorded.